Hello, my name is Vicky Feldman, and I'm a product manager for Oracle Public Sector Revenue Management products. And this tutorial will help you to learn the features and functions of one of our PSRM modules, which is self-service. And this specific chapter will help you to understand how to create form validation and calculation rules using Oracle Policy Automation tool. So let's look at the process of creating the validation rules for the form. The step number one will be to export form data model. And form structure describes the structure of the form. It contains the collection of the attribute that define form sections and the attribute inside of form sections, and each attribute will have its own definitions such as name and size and type and stuff like that. So altogether that creates the definition of the form. So in order for you to build the rule in a PA, you would need all these attributes because you're probably going to build your validation for the subset of this attribute. So step number one exports this data model from PSRM self-service admin data, and it creates a PA rule model. So what is a PA rule model? A PA rule model represents entities and attributes and relationships using which you can create your rules. So rather than creating this rule model manually, it will be created for you based upon this expert. So the step number one will take this definition from PSRM self-service and generate similar definition, same definition, but using OPA notations. Your step number two will be write your rule documents, and your rule documents may contain the validation. As I mentioned, this document is required, name is required, ID type is required, amount used required, or some kind of calculation such as your tax amount is equal gross amount by tax rate and stuff like that. So you create your validation rule, you create your calculation rules in APA, you test them, you deploy them, and your next step will be to go back to PSRM and start using your form validation rules. So you would need to do some additional admin configuration, such as go back to your form and tell exactly which rule should be associated with this rule. And once this step is done, you can start using this rule in the validation. So for example, taxpayer will go and he will start using the forms, and the moment he will click test check form data button, the OPA rule will be called and the message will come back showing the error, or if there are no errors, it'll say your form was checked successfully. And if it has pre-calculation step, the fields that should be pre-calculated will be populated with the values. So now let's go to self-service and see how that can be done. So let's go to the PSRM self-service administration and look at the form that we created in earlier session. So we go to form designer, we go to the search, and we created our simple individual income form. It's a very basic form, and if we look at this form, we will see that it has just a few attributes, right? So it has taxpayer name, ID type, ID number, and it has gross amount, tax rate, and tax amount, right? So for example, if I look at my tax amount field, you will see that now this field is defined as an input field, but I want my validation rule to pre-calculate this field. It's easy to do it because let's assume that tax amount is equal to gross amount and tax rate. And gross amount field is user input field, tax rate is display only field, and we already defined that it's equal to 13%, and tax amount was supposed to be user input field, but I will make this field display only. Okay. Oh, in order to make this field display only, I need to go back to form definition and unlock this form. So now I can go back to layout designer. go to tax amount field, make this field display only. Okay, so if I look at my form now, this is how it looks. There is a personal information section and there is line item section. Oh yeah, it wants me to enter the name, Mary Smith. And let's look at line item section. So now tax amount became display only field, right? So I want to go back to layout designer and I want to check to my taxpayer information section. So the taxpayer name field is labeled as required, but I want to make it optional and I want OPA rule to validate that taxpayer name is provided. So for example, my rule will be also very simple. It will say that taxpayer name is required and it will calculate tax amount. So let's say save and let's go back to form definition. So after you're done with the design of your form, you can now go and do the step 1, which I showed before, such as export this data model into OPA rule data model. So to generate rule-based model, we go to the tab which is called validation and we click generate rule-based model button. So what happens, it opens the Explorer window and it asks us to provide a name, and let's call it individual simple, and we need to change an extension because by default the extension is XML. However, OPA has its own extension for property file or rule-based model, so the extension should be XSRC. So now let's save it. And now when this model is created, we can go and actually create the validation rule. So we will go to Oracle Policy Automation and we create a new project. And let's call it simple individual. So the project doesn't have any files associated with that yet. So let's find our property file with the rule-based model and link it to the property folder. So we choose add existing file option and we go to the folder where we saved our model and we choose the model. Here it is. Okay. So now let's see how this model looks. So what happens here, the structure of this model represents the structure of our rule. So it's the same levels that our not rule but the form that our form has. So if I go back and if I go to layout designer, let's see. So the form has section, personal information and line items, and the section have lines. So 3 levels: form, personal information, line items are represented by very similar hierarchy. Higher level entity form, next level that has embedded entity line items and embedded entity personal information, and this entity has included entities which is gross amount, tax amount, and tax rate. So let's see how the names of these fields were generated. Let me show you. So if you look at the section, you see that the section has label, and label is basically the description which will be on the screen. But it also has the actual name, right? And the same goes to taxpayer name. It also has the name and the label, but the application knows this line by the name. So the same exact names were used when the model was generated. So the items called line item section, right? And the lines within the section are prefixed with the line items and the name of the line, gross amounts, tax amount, and tax rate. And this is fine, this will work, but what I can do to make this form more visible, I can go and I can change this name to something which will be easier are nicer on the screen and on the rule. So I can go and start changing the name. So I can only change entity text. I cannot change public name, because public name is actually the attribute which is used for mapping. The system knows that this public name corresponds to that public name. I mean that line name. And when the data is sent from the form to the rule and passed back, the system does the mapping, and the mapping is done based upon correlation between this name and that name. So this is something that I should never change, but I can go and change this name, the gross amount, because entity text is for external use, I would say. Yes, I want to update it. And I can also go, and I don't even need to go inside of the attribute. I can just type the new name here. So let's call it the tax amount, and let's call that, yes, and let's call that the tax rate. Okay, and this is the ID number, the ID type, and this is the taxpayer name. Okay, yes, nice. So now let's look at the attributes that belong to this entity. So let's look at the high-level entity, which is form. If we click on this entity, we will see the collection of the attributes associated with the form. And some of the attributes are sent by the integration. So some attributes are the input attributes that were entered in the form, and some attributes the rule writer will have to populate, and they will come back to the form, and self-service will evaluate these attributes and do something with them. So important attributes that the rule writer needs to set is form contains an error, because this indicates to self-service that the validation found an error, and this error needs to be identified and show back to the taxpayer. So if we look at the line item section, you will see very similar attributes. Some of them are property of the line items like a sequence, and some of them can be used by the rule writer. So if there is an error on the section level and you want self-service to show this error back to taxpayer, you populate this error message and you say that the section contains an error. If any of the attributes inside this section will end up with the error, you would need to say that section contains an error. Why? Because when self-service starts evaluation of the XML that came back after OPA processed it, it's going to first try to understand if there are any errors. So how does it do it? It looks at the attribute in the high level. It checks if the form contains an error, and if it doesn't, it shows the message the form was validated successfully. So once it understands that form contains an error, it's trying to see which section contains the error, and it'll go to the section, line item section, and it checks if section contain error flag is set to true. And if it is, it'll start to see which attributes have the error messages. It'll collect these error messages and show them. So let's look at the attribute. So attributes has 4 value, and first value is basically attribute identifier, gross amount, and there is an attribute which is called submitted value. So gross amount submitted value will contain a value that was entered by a taxpayer. So submitted value always the value that was entered by taxpayer and that was sent to the rule. So now what the rule can do is to evaluate this value and see if there are any errors. For example, gross amount is set to blank and is supposed to have a value. And if that's the case, it can populate error message attribute. So the next attribute, which is error message, is populated in case if there is a problem with this attribute and validation indicated that is it contains the error, and the error message, text error message, is populated, right? So when self-service starts evaluating the errors, it'll first check if form contains error, and if it does, it checks if section contains the error, and if it does, it then starts checking error messages, and if there are any, they will be displayed back to the user. And another interesting attribute is determine value. So the way determine value is used if your rule needs to update the value that was sent. For example, it does the calculation or recalculation. This value should be placed in determine value attribute. For example, your tax amount is equal to tax rate multiplied by gross amount. So if you want the rule either to calculate or to override the amount that was sent by taxpayer, you do the formula. Tax amount is equal gross amount by tax rate, and you put this value into determine value, because when form XML comes back after IPA processes it, self-service will take the values populated in determine value attribute if it's not empty, and it will display them back to taxpayer instead of submitted value. So the integration, the interface, generates these four attributes for every line in the form. So see, like tax amount has this value, tax rate has this value. So now how this error message will be populated and how this line item section will know that section contains the error, this is the responsibility of the rule writer. So we will try to write the rule which will have all this logic, and our rule will have one validation rule, and it will say that taxpayer name is required, and it will also do a calculation. It will calculate tax amount as gross amount by tax rate. So now let's start writing the actual rule. So let's create rule document, add new Word document, individual simple rule. And let's start writing our rule. So first we need to tell what is our goal. So let's say the interview conclusion. The interview is complete if. So the interview is complete if we have two goals. First of all, validate the form, and if there are any errors, show them. And the second goal is to calculate tax amount. So when do we know that form contains error or not? We know whether form contains error or not so the form contains the error if this value is set to true, right? So this is one of the attributes that needs to be evaluated by the rule. So the interview is complete if it is known whether form contains an error, and so we also need to know the value of this attribute, gross amount determined value, right? So, and gross amount determined value is known. Okay. So let's check if this compiles, if we didn't make any errors yet. Strip hidden. So now let's do the second part. The gross amount determined value. It's easy for us to determine it because we can simply calculate it based upon the other attributes. So the gross amount determined value is equal to tax rate. And for tax rate, we need to take submitted value because this is what came from the form. This is the amount that was specified on the form. Tax rate by tax amount. Tax amount submitted value, because we didn't do any recalculation of tax amount. So I mean gross amount. gross amount submitted value. We didn't do any recalculation of gross amount, so whatever came, whatever was in the form is good for us. Okay, done. So now let's come to the first part, first goal. So how do we know that the form contains an error? So in order for us to know whether the form contains an error, we need to determine, first of all, if that we want to validate contains an error. So and this will be personal information section, because taxpayer name belongs to personal information section. So if we want the system to check taxpayer name error message, we first need to give the indication that there is a problem in this section, in this level. So the form contains an error if personal information section contains error. Okay, so this is our second condition. Now let's describe when this section contains an error. Let's set this rule. So the personal information section contains an error if, guess what? If taxpayer name error message is known, right? Because when the PSRM self-service sends us the form XML, this value is unknown. So if taxpayer name error message is known, then the section contains the error. So let's keep saying if the taxpayer error message is known, because initially it will be unknown. And now the last thing that we have to do, we need to set up this taxpayer error message. And in order for us to do it, let's use rule table. So what we want to say here, let's just make a space. The taxpayer error message is equal. Now let's put some kind of meaningful text. Taxpayer name must be provided if it's not provided. So if it is not provided, then this submitted value is not known. If this submitted value is unknown, and otherwise it will be uncertain. Okay, so our rule is ready. We evaluated taxpayer name and we calculated the value. So let's compile it. And it goes fine through the compilation. And now let's build it. Let's see if we can create executable. Fine. And let's try to do basic debugging before we go to self-service and run it from there. So if you want to debug it, we suggest you to just use rule debugger without any screens. And what we'll do, we will just add instances and we'll check if the values of these instances are calculated properly. So first, personal information, add instance, and let's add an instance of taxpayer name, and this instance came back, for example, empty, so taxpayer name is unknown, and the error message got populated. It says that taxpayer name error message is set to taxpayer name must be provided. So section level error message is set to true, and form level error message is set to true. So this part of our rule works fine, and we can also check if the calculation will work fine. So let's add an instance here, and we can say that, for example, gross amount is equal, let's say, to 100, and tax rate submitted value is equal to 10. And let's check the value of tax amount. So we see that tax amount is unknown, which is weird because I was expected to see it having a value. So let's see what's wrong with our rule. So let's review this rule again, and when we review it, we see that I made a mistake. I set a tab gross amount value, and I was supposed to set tax amount value. So we say that tax amount determined value is equal, and now I see another mistake because our tax rate is specified not in decimals but in actual numbers, so we also need to divide the result by 100. Now it looks better, so now let's go and check our rule again. So let's build it and restart debugger. Okay, so add instance here, and we don't need to check personal information section because we haven't done anything, but we can check our line item section again. So tax rate submitted value will be, for example, 5%. Our gross amount submitted value will be 100. And now let's see how our tax amount was calculated. At instance, okay, it is equal to $5, which seems to be a right result. My rule is ready to be deployed, and the next step will be to deploy it to the server. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to deploy this rule, and we will go to self-service and see the next step of working with this rule. So our next step is to come back to self-service and link this interview to the form that it's supposed to validate. So we need to do some configurations for that. Let's go to configuration menu and let's define this OPA rule as the valid interview. So we're gonna go to interview set, admin table, and we need to link it to the interview set that has a category of form validation. So I already have existing interview set which belongs to category data validation, and this interview set points to the same server where this new rule was deployed. So what I need to do, I just need to load this interview, and if you don't have any data validation interview sets yet, you can create one. And now go to interview section and let me find my simple individual rule. Oh, here it is, and I make it active and eligible for specifying as the validation rule. Okay, 4, 5. Save. Wonderful. So now it's here and it's active, so I can go to the next step. And next step, oh sorry, I need to save it. And next step is to set up the validation rule which will point to this interview. So I'm going to validation rule, and I wanna add a new interview. I wanna call it simple individual. So let's see how this rule is going to work. So this is our simple individual income, and I didn't specify any data, and I'm saying check form data. So this should call our rule, and it should complete that taxpayer name is not specified. Okay, yeah, taxpayer name must be provided. So this is the error that this rule is supposed to return. Okay, so let's provide it. Load up. Smith. ID type social security. ID value. And now let's go to line up item section and check if the second part works. So let's add our gross amount, and let's assume that it's 1,000. And let's click check form data, and this time it should go and calculate tax amount for us. And now the form data completed successfully and the amount was calculated. So our rule works, and it did both things that we wanted to do. And this concludes our today tutorial about how to validate self-service forms using a payroll engine. And also I want to remind that all this data that you saw in this demo today is available in product demo data environment, and that includes forms and configurations and OPA rules. So if you want to learn more or look into details and examples that you've been watching today in this video, just check out PSRM demo data. Thank you.